Before the sun cleared, the Eastern Ridge tractors were already moving through Bellwether Valley. One by one, mower blades dropped into the fields, cutting long paths through grass that had begun to turn gold. The smell of fresh hay spread through the cool morning air. After nearly 2 weeks of unstable weather, every farmer in the valley had been waiting for the same thing: 3 clear days. The forecast showed no rain until Thursday evening. Temperatures would be high, and the wind was expected to remain steady. On paper, it looked like the best harvest window they had seen all month. To the farmers of Bellwether Valley, the forecast was not merely encouraging. It was a command to move. Dean Mercer was the first to begin. His farm sat beside the main road, covering more than 200 acres. Beneath a steel-roofed shed stood a line of modern red machines, each larger and faster than anything most of his neighbors owned. By 7 in the morning, Dean had already cut a quarter of his southern field. He lifted the radio inside his tractor. "Best window we've had all season. Anyone still sitting at home by noon will be watching good hay get old." Several voices answered with laughter. Across the valley, more engines came to life. But at the far end of Bellwether, one field remained untouched. The grass on the Ward farm stood nearly waist-high. Seed heads moved gently across the hillside, while the lower field stretched toward an old creek bed. Elena Ward's tractor was still inside the barn. The fuel tank was full. The mower blades had been sharpened the night before, but Elena had not started the engine. She stood halfway across the field with a worn brown notebook in one hand. With the other, she reached beneath the upper layer of grass and touched the stems close to the ground. Sunlight had already warmed the tops. Below them, beads of moisture still clung to the leaves. Elena crouched and pulled up a small handful from the base. She pressed it between her fingers, then held it against her cheek. The grass was not only wet, it was cold. The moisture had not yet begun to leave the dense lower layer. She checked her watch. 7 a.m. Then she wrote in the notebook, "Dew holding on the middle slope. No ground wind." An engine slowed near the road. Dean Mercer's black pickup stopped beside the fence. He lowered the window and looked across the uncut field. "Elena," she turned. "Machine broken, no. Out of fuel, no." Dean looked toward the barn, then up at the nearly cloudless sky. "Then what are you waiting for?" Elena did not answer immediately. She looked toward the line of cottonwood trees growing beside the old creek bed. Their upper branches were moving, but the grass around her boots remained almost still. There was wind above the field. There was none moving through it. "I'm waiting for the grass to give me a clearer answer," she said. Dean gave a short laugh. "The grass has already answered. It's ready. We have 3 days before the rain. By noon, you'll already be losing quality." Elena knew he was right about one thing. The crop was close to passing its best stage for feed. Each additional day could leave the stems harder, reduce the leaf content, and lower the price buyers were willing to pay. Dean also knew she could not afford a poor harvest. Everyone in the valley knew. The previous winter, Elena had borrowed money to repair the transmission on her old tractor. The next payment was due in less than 3 weeks. This cutting was supposed to cover most of it. Dean studied the field one last time. Hay doesn't wait for people who can't make up their minds. He raised the window and drove away. Dust rolled along the fence line behind him. Elena remained where she was. A few minutes later, her 16-year-old daughter, Mara, hurried down from the barn. Her boots were barely tied, and she held a phone in one hand. "Mom, everyone has started. I know. The chance of rain today is 10%. Tomorrow, too." Elena pointed toward the grass at their feet. "Touch it." Mara reached for the sunlit tops. "It's dry. Not there." Elena parted the grass and exposed the lower stems. Mara reached down. When she pulled her hand back, her palm was wet. "It's just dew." "Yes. The sun will burn it off. The question isn't whether the dew will disappear." Elena broke a stem at the middle joint. The outside had begun to warm, but the inner tissue was still cool and soft. "The question is whether the whole crop can lose enough moisture before we have to bale it." Mara looked across the valley toward Dean's field. Long rows of cut hay lay beneath the sun. His equipment moved quickly and evenly. From a distance, everything looked controlled. Only her mother stood in an uncut field, writing down the time the dew began to lift. "What if you're wrong?" Mara asked. Elena closed the notebook. "If I'm wrong, we lose some quality. And if you're right..." Elena looked toward the fresh rows appearing across the neighboring farms. "Then all that hay will still be lying on the ground when the weather changes." In the distance, Dean turned his tractor and began another pass. The mower swept through the field. Elena walked back toward the barn, but she did not climb into her tractor. Instead, she collected a small scale, 2 paper bags, and several wooden stakes painted red. Mara watched from the doorway. What are you doing? Cutting a test strip. Only one strip, Elena nodded. Before I risk the whole field, I want to know how quickly this grass is actually losing water. By 8 o'clock, every farm in Bellwether Valley had entered a race against the storm predicted to arrive 3 days later. Elena Ward was not racing the forecast. She was measuring whether her field had truly been given 3 days at all. The Ward farm had survived bad seasons before. It had survived drought, falling cattle prices, broken equipment, and one winter when ice sealed the roads for nearly 2 weeks. But this year was different. There was no reserve left. Elena sat at the kitchen table with 3 envelopes arranged in front of her. The first was from the bank. The second was from the repair shop. The third came from the feed supplier who had allowed her to delay payment until after the hay harvest. Mara stood at the sink washing dirt from her hands. She tried not to look at the envelopes, but the numbers had already become familiar. The tractor repair had cost more than expected. The lower field needed new drainage work before winter. Property taxes were due in the fall. And the buyer who normally purchased most of their hay had made one condition clear: the bales had to be dry clean and delivered on schedule. Elena opened the bank letter again. The next payment was due in 19 days. She had calculated the harvest so many times that she no longer needed paper. If the field produced what it had produced the year before, and if most of the hay qualified for the higher feed grade, she could make the payment cover the repair bill and keep enough money for seed and fuel. If the hay sold at the lower grade, she would barely cover the bank. If a large part of the crop spoiled, she would have to sell something. There was only one thing on the farm valuable enough to make a real difference: the upper pasture. It was the highest, driest piece of ground they owned. Elena's father had planted it years earlier, clearing stones by hand and rebuilding the fence one post at a time. A developer had already offered to buy it. Elena had refused twice. She had not told Mara about the third offer. Mara dried her hands and turned toward the table. Are we going to lose the farm? Elena folded the bank letter. No. The answer came quickly but not firmly enough. Mara noticed. You paused. I was thinking. That usually means the answer is worse than the word. Elena leaned back in the chair. We are not losing the farm. Then what happens if the hay is bad? We find another way. What way? Elena looked toward the window. Beyond the glass, the upper pasture rose behind the barn, green and open beneath the morning sun. Mara followed her gaze. You would sell it. Elena said nothing. That's what you mean, isn't it? It would only be part of it. Grandpa built that pasture. I know. He said it was the one field on this farm that never betrayed him. Elena's expression tightened. Your grandfather also believed land was supposed to keep a family alive. He would not want us protecting one field while losing everything around it. Mara pulled out a chair but did not sit. Then why are we waiting? The question carried more anger than fear now. Everyone else is cutting. The forecast is clear. We need this crop. But you're acting like we can afford to stand still. Elena placed both hands flat on the table. I am not standing still. It looks like it. I'm trying to keep us from turning a difficult harvest into a ruined one. Mara shook her head. You don't know that it will be ruined. No. And you don't know that the storm will come early. No. Then Dean could be right. He could. The answer seemed to frustrate Mara more than an argument would have. She wanted certainty. Elena had none to give her. That was the part no one in the valley understood. Elena was not delaying because she believed she could predict the weather better than everyone else. She was delaying because she believed the margin for error was smaller than they realized. If she cut too late, the grass would lose some feeding value. If she cut too early and the hay remained wet in the field, she could lose much more. The risk was not balanced. One mistake reduced the price. The other could destroy the crop. Elena gathered the letters and returned them to the drawer beneath the telephone. Come with me, she said. Where? To the test strip. They walked uphill toward the narrow section Elena had cut earlier that morning. The strip was barely wider than the mower. Red stakes marked its beginning and end. The cut grass lay in a thin row under direct sun. Mara looked at it. It seems dry already. The surface does. Elena knelt and lifted the top layer. The grass beneath was darker. She took samples from 3 places: the upper edge of the strip, the center, and the lower side, closest to the shallow depression in the field. She placed each sample in a separate paper bag and wrote the location and time on the front. Mara watched. What will that tell us? How evenly it's drying. And if it's drying fast, we start cutting. Mara looked surprised. So you might change your mind, of course. I thought you had already decided. I decided not to risk the whole field without evidence. They carried the samples into the barn. On the workbench, Elena weighed each bag and wrote down the numbers. She would weigh them again later and compare the loss. Mara leaned against the bench. Dean doesn't do this. Dean has faster equipment. What does that change? If he cuts today and the weather turns, he can move through his fields faster. He has 2 tedders, 3 balers, and enough hired men to work through the night. And we don't. We have 1 tractor that overheats when it climbs the north slope, 1 rake and a baler that jams if the windrows are too heavy. Mara looked toward the old machine at the back of the barn. Its yellow paint had faded. Several sections had been repaired with parts taken from older equipment, so we need more time than he does. Yes, that was another detail the forecast could not measure. The same 3 clear days did not mean the same thing to every farm. Dean could cut hundreds of acres, quickly turn the hay twice, and bale before Elena had finished half her field. For him, a short weather window was a challenge. For Elena, it was a trap. At midday, the buyer called. His name was Russell Pike, and he supplied hay to several horse farms north of the county. He had purchased from the Ward farm for 6 years, but loyalty had limits when animals depended on clean feed. "Elena," he said, "I'm hearing everyone is cutting today." "They are." "Are you?" "Not yet." There was a silence on the line. "I need 80 bales from you by next week." "I know. I have customers waiting. You'll have them." "Dean says you haven't even started." Elena glanced at Mara, who was listening from the other side of the kitchen. "I cut a test strip this morning. A test strip won't fill my trucks." "No, but wet hay won't either." Russell exhaled. "I can't hold space for you indefinitely." "How long?" 2 days. After that, I'll have to buy elsewhere." Elena tightened her grip on the phone. "If the hay is ready, I'll call, and if it isn't, then you should buy elsewhere." Mara stared at her. Russell was silent again. "You understand what you're risking, yes." When the call ended, Mara stepped forward. "You just told our biggest buyer to leave. I told him not to wait for hay. I may not be able to deliver safely. What happens if he buys from Dean? Then we find another market." With the loan due in 19 days, Elena did not answer. Mara turned away and walked out of the kitchen. The screen door closed hard behind her. Elena remained beside the telephone. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself to look toward Dean's farm with envy. His machines had already covered most of the southern field. Workers moved behind the tractors, checking equipment and preparing for the next stage. From a distance, his decision looked simple. Cut now, dry quickly, bale before the rain. Elena wanted the same simplicity. But wanting a decision to be safe did not make it safe. She returned to the barn late that afternoon. The 3 paper bags sat on the workbench. She weighed them again. The sample from the upper edge had lost a noticeable amount of moisture. The center sample had lost less. The sample from the lower side had barely changed. Elena wrote the results in her notebook. The field was not drying as one field. It was drying as 3 different places. Mara stood in the doorway. She had returned quietly. "Well," she asked. "The upper ground might be ready to cut tomorrow. And the rest, not at this rate." Mara stepped closer to the workbench. "So what do we do?" Elena looked at the map of the farm pinned to the wall. Her father had drawn it by hand years ago. The fields were divided not by legal boundaries but by how they behaved. Fast ground, cold slope, heavy bottom, wind break, late drying corner. Elena picked up a pencil. "We stopped treating the whole farm as if it has the same weather." She drew a line across the upper field. "We cut this section first, but only if the test strip keeps drying overnight." Then she marked the middle slope. "This waits." Finally, she circled the low ground near the old creek bed. "And this waits longer." Mara studied the map. "That will slow us down." "Yes. We may not finish before the rain." "Yes. And Russell may buy from someone else." "Yes." Mara looked at her mother. "Then how do you know this is the right choice?" Elena set the pencil down. "I don't." The honesty stopped Mara. Elena pointed toward the 3 paper bags. "But I know what the field has shown us today. I know what our machines can do, and I know how much damage we can survive." She touched the bag from the lower ground. "We can survive hay that is slightly older." Then she looked toward the baler. "We cannot survive a barn full of wet bales." Outside, the sound of Dean's machinery continued across the valley. His farm was moving faster. His fields were nearly cut, and by sunset, Elena Ward had still harvested almost nothing. But she had made the decision that would determine whether the Ward farm kept its upper pasture. She would not harvest according to the pressure around her. She would harvest according to the amount of risk her land and her family could actually bear. Elena returned to the field before sunrise. The sky was clear, and the stars remained visible above the western ridge. According to the forecast, the day would be warmer than the last, with steady wind by mid-morning. It looked promising. But the test strip told a different story. A pale layer of dew covered the cut grass. The upper surface glistened beneath Elena's flashlight, while the bottom of the windrow felt cold against the soil. She lifted a handful and squeezed it. The grass had regained much of the moisture it had lost the previous afternoon. Mara arrived several minutes later, wrapped in an old canvas jacket. Did it stay dry? No. Elena handed her a handful from the top of the row. Mara rubbed it between her fingers. It doesn't feel that wet. Now take some from underneath. Mara reached deeper into the windrow. When she pulled her hand back, the grass clung together. That's much worse. The ground released moisture during the night. The hay trapped it. Elena opened her notebook and recorded the time, air temperature, and condition of the strip. Mara looked toward the brightening horizon. But today is supposed to be clear. It probably will be. Then why does this matter? Because the hay has to lose yesterday's moisture again before it can make any progress today. Every morning began with a debt. Before the crop could become drier than it had been the day before, the sun first had to remove the moisture it had absorbed overnight. If the dew disappeared early, the field gained many useful drying hours. If it remained until late morning, most of the day was already gone. Elena walked toward the middle slope. The uncut grass reached above her knees. Moisture collected heavily near the base where sunlight had not yet penetrated. She stopped beside a spiderweb stretched between two stems. Every strand held a line of water droplets. "What does that tell you?" Elena asked. Mara examined it. That there was dew. "Look at the time." Mara checked her phone. 6:48. Now look uphill. The webs near the top of the field were already beginning to lose their droplets. Lower down they remained completely covered. "The same sky is over both places," Elena said. "But they are not having the same morning." They continued toward the old creek bed. The creek had been dry for most of Mara's life, but the land still carried the shape of water. The ground dipped gently between two low ridges, and the soil there was darker than the rest of the farm. Elena pushed a metal rod into the ground. It entered easily. She repeated the test farther uphill. There the soil resisted after only a few inches. "The lower field is holding more moisture," Mara said. "It always does. Because of the old creek, partly. Water moved through this ground long before either of us was here. Even when the channel looks dry, the soil remembers where the water used to collect." Elena pointed toward the surrounding grass. The plants in the depression were taller and greener. Their stems were thicker, and the lower leaves remained soft, while the grass on the ridge had already begun to yellow. The difference had helped the crop grow. Now it would slow the harvest. The richer-looking section would need more time to dry because it contained more water and stood above cooler soil. From the road, Dean's fields looked uniform. So did Elena's. But inside each field were smaller climates, shaped by slope-shade soil and the movement of air. A regional forecast could describe the valley. It could not describe every acre within it. A breeze touched the tops of the cottonwood trees. Their leaves turned pale as they moved. At ground level, the grass remained still. Mara noticed it before Elena spoke. "The wind still isn't reaching us." Elena nodded. "Not yet. Why?" "Cold air settles low at night. This part of the field is protected by the ridge and the tree line. The air has to warm before it begins moving. So Dean's field could be getting more wind than ours. It is. Dean's southern field lay higher and faced the morning sun. Wind moved across it freely from the open road. That did not mean his entire crop would dry safely, but it meant copying his schedule made little sense. His land machinery and labor were different. The two farms stood less than a mile apart, yet they were not working under identical conditions. A tractor engine approached from behind them. Ben Holloway stopped beside the fence on an old blue machine. He had farmed the neighboring property for more than 40 years and had known Elena's father since they were boys. He shut off the engine. Still testing, Elena nodded. Ben looked toward the cut strip. "Your father used to leave his coat on that fence." Mara glanced at the empty post. "Why?" "To watch the sleeves." She frowned. Ben pointed toward the ridge. "The treetops can move while the lower field stays dead still. A coat hanging near the ground tells you whether air is actually passing through the hay." Elena remembered. Her father's brown work coat had often hung from the fence for hours, one sleeve extended toward the field. If it remained limp, he waited. Mara smiled faintly. "That sounds less scientific than a weather station." It was a cheap wind flag, Ben said. Your grandfather never claimed it was magic. He looked across the valley where Dean's workers had begun turning the previous day's hay. They're moving fast. They have to, Elena said. Ben's expression hardened. Pressure dropped last night. Mara looked at him. You think it will rain early? I think the air is changing faster than the forecast did yesterday. Elena did not answer. Ben understood why. One sign was not enough. Falling pressure could indicate an approaching system, but it did not prove when rain would reach the valley. Neither did low-flying birds' heavy dew or a change in wind direction. Any one of those signs could mislead them. Together, however, they could reveal a pattern. Ben started his tractor again. Your father used to say the sky tells you what may happen. The field tells you how much it will cost. He drove away. By 8:30, sunlight had reached the test strip. Elena spread part of the cut grass into a thinner layer and left the rest untouched. She marked both sections. What are we comparing? Mara asked. Airflow. The thick section held moisture underneath. The thin section exposed more surface area to sun and wind. If the wind strengthened, the thinner hay would dry faster. If the air remained humid and still, neither section would make enough progress. They returned every hour. At 9:30, the upper surfaces had warmed. At 10:30, the thinner section had begun to feel crisp at the tips, but inside the stems moisture remained. At 11:30, Elena twisted several stalks. They bent without breaking. She split one with her thumbnail. The interior was still green and cool. Mara looked toward the sun. It feels hot enough. Heat is only one part of drying. What else? Moving air and low humidity. The sun could warm the crop, but if the surrounding air already held too much moisture, water escaped slowly from the stems. Without wind, damp air remained trapped close to the ground. That was what Elena had been waiting to see. Not whether the day looked sunny, whether the field could release moisture faster than the air returned it. Near noon, the ground wind finally arrived. The grass around their boots began to move. Elena tied one of her father's old cloth handkerchiefs to a fence post. It lifted weakly, then fell. A few minutes later, it lifted again. The breeze was inconsistent. Mara watched it. Is that enough? For the upper field, perhaps? Elena looked toward the ridge where the grass had less moisture and more exposure, but not enough for the lower ground. She walked back to the test strip and collected another set of samples. When they weighed them in the barn, the thin section had lost more moisture than the thicker one. But the progress was still slower than Elena wanted. They had already lost the entire morning. Only the afternoon remained. Then the air would begin cooling again, and moisture would return. Mara studied the numbers. So even if we cut now, the grass won't really start drying until tomorrow. Much of it won't. And if tomorrow begins the same way, then we lose another morning. And the storm is expected the day after that. Yes. Mara finally saw the problem clearly. The forecast showed 3 days without rain. But the farm did not receive 72 continuous hours of drying. It received short windows between late dew and rising evening humidity. The calendar counted days. The hay depended on hours. Elena walked to the wall map and drew 3 columns beside the upper field. Today, limited afternoon drying. Tomorrow, uncertain morning, possible stronger wind. Third-day weather system approaching. She added the hours together. There was enough time to cut and cure the driest part of the ridge if conditions improved. There was not enough time for the whole farm. Mara stood beside her. Then we divided. Yes. We cut the ridge and leave the rest standing. Yes. What will people say? Elena put down the pencil. They will say I was too frightened to finish. Mara looked toward Dean's farm. His workers were turning long rows of hay beneath the noon sun. Their movements looked efficient and confident. Are you frightened? Yes. Mara had not expected the answer. Elena folded the farm map. Fear is useful when it tells you where the danger is. It becomes useless when it makes the decision for you. She pointed toward the ridge. We cut what the field can dry. Then she pointed toward the middle slope and the old creek bed. We leave the rest standing. That afternoon, Elena lowered the mower into the upper field. The blade moved through the grass in a narrow path along the ridge, where the soil was warmest and the breeze strongest. She did not continue downhill. From across the road, several farmers stopped to watch. To them, the unfinished field looked like hesitation. To Elena, the line between cut and standing grass marked the exact boundary between acceptable risk and a gamble she could not afford. She had not discovered when the storm would arrive. She had discovered something more important. Most of her land would not be ready before it did. That evening, Elena carried the first samples from the ridge into the barn. The cut grass had spent several hours under the strongest wind the farm had received all day. Its surface felt dry, but Elena did not trust the surface. She separated the stems, selected several from the middle of the row, and bent them slowly. They folded without snapping. Mara watched from the workbench. So it still isn't ready, not even close. Elena split one stem lengthwise with her thumbnail. The center was pale green and cool. That moisture has to move from inside the stem to the surface, she explained. Then the air has to carry it away. Heat alone cannot finish the job. She placed the sample on the scale and wrote the weight in her notebook. The barn had grown quiet. Across the valley, the sound of tractors was finally fading. Dean's crew had turned most of his cut hay and arranged it into wider rows. If the next day brought stronger wind, he might be ready to bale before evening. Elena closed the notebook. Mara looked toward the shelves behind the workbench. Several older notebooks stood there, their covers stained by dust, oil, and rain. Some belonged to Elena. The oldest had belonged to her father. Did Grandpa weigh every field too? Not at first. Elena took down a dark green notebook held together with cloth tape. He learned after he lost a whole cutting. Mara had never heard that story. Elena opened the book carefully. The first pages contained simple notes, cutting dates, rainfall, field names, and the number of bales collected. Later pages were more detailed. Her father had recorded the time the dew lifted, the direction of the wind, and the condition of the hay at different hours. Near the center of the notebook was a page marked with a thick black line. Elena turned the book toward Mara. The date was 23 years earlier. Her father had cut the lower field, after 2 clear days were forecast. The hay dried quickly on top, and a buyer pressured him to bale before a line of rain arrived. He tested several handfuls near the edge of the field. They felt dry. He baled before sunset. 3 days later he smelled something in the barn, Elena said. What, caramel? Mara frowned. That sounds good. In a kitchen, perhaps. Inside a bale, the sweet smell had meant the hay was heating. The outer layers had dried, but moisture remained trapped inside the thicker stems and the lower sections of the windrows. Once tightly compressed, the damp plant material began producing heat through microbial activity. Her father opened one bale. Steam rose from the center. He checked the others, and found several more heating inside. He spent the night breaking them apart and spreading the hay across the barnyard. He saved the barn, Elena said, but he lost most of the crop. Mara studied the page. Beside the notes, her grandfather had written one sentence in capital letters, "Dry to the hand is not dry through the stem." Was there a fire? Mara asked. No, but there could have been. After that harvest, Elena's father changed the way he worked. He stopped checking only the top of the windrow. He took samples from the center and the bottom. He compared grass from the ridge with grass from the lower ground. He recorded how quickly each section dried under different wind and humidity conditions. He also stopped treating the weather forecast as a complete answer. The forecast told him the probability of rain over a large area. It did not tell him when dew would lift from the cold slope. It did not measure the moisture rising from the old creek bed. It did not know how long his equipment needed to cut, turn, rake, and bale the entire farm. He wasn't against forecasts, Elena said. He listened to them every morning. Then why did people call him old-fashioned? Because he refused to let one number replace everything else. Elena flipped through several pages. Her father had used symbols to describe each field. A circle meant the ground dried evenly. A triangle meant moisture collected near the bottom. A short horizontal line meant the field was protected from wind. Beside the lower field, he had drawn all 3 symbols. Mara traced them with one finger. So this is why you left it standing. It is part of the reason. What is the other part? Our equipment. Elena opened her own notebook beside her father's. Her calculations showed how many acres she could cut in an hour, how long it took to turn the hay, and how many bales the old machine could finish before dark. Even if the weather remained dry, she could not move through the farm as quickly as Dean. A safe harvest window was not only a question of weather, it was also a question of capacity. How much can we cut? Mara asked. If tomorrow brings steady wind, we can finish the ridge and perhaps the upper half of the middle slope. And the rest, it remained standing. Mara looked disappointed. That means fewer bales. It means fewer bales exposed on the ground if the storm arrives early. Elena pointed to the old notebook. Your grandfather's mistake was not that he failed to predict rain. His mistake was putting more hay on the ground than he could safely finish. That was the lesson Elena had carried for years. A farmer could not control the storm. She could control how much of the crop was vulnerable when it arrived. Mara picked up the sample from the ridge and bent another stem. It folded easily. What should it do when it is ready? For baling, the stems should be much drier, but we do not depend on one test. We check different parts of the row. We use the moisture meter. We compare the weight. And we pay attention to the thickest stems because they dry last. Mara placed the stem back on the bench, so there is no single sign. No. Then how do you ever become certain you don't? Elena's answer was immediate. You collect enough evidence to reduce the risk. That is different from certainty. Outside, a truck passed on the road. Dean's voice carried from the open window. Better hurry, Elena, tomorrow we bail. The truck continued toward town. Mara waited for her mother to respond, but Elena remained beside the workbench. She turned to a fresh page in the notebook and wrote 3 headings: field condition, equipment, time, weather, window. Under each heading she listed only what she knew. The ridge was drying, the middle slope was uncertain, the lower field remained too wet. Their equipment could finish only a limited area before the storm. The forecast still showed rain on Thursday, but pressure continued to fall. Mara read the page. Grandpa taught you to wait, no, Elena said. He taught me not to confuse movement with progress. She closed the old notebook and returned it to the shelf. The next morning, Elena would begin cutting the ground that had earned her confidence. She would leave the rest untouched, even if the entire valley laughed again. The lesson her father had left behind was not a rule about harvesting late. It was a rule about exposure. Never place more of the farm at risk than the land, the weather, and the machines can safely carry. By mid-morning, Elena had cut only the upper ridge. The rest of the Ward farm remained standing. From the road, the decision looked unfinished. A clean strip of cut hay followed the high ground, then stopped sharply where the slope began to fall. Below it, tall grass still covered the middle field and the dark soil near the old creek bed. Dean Mercer stopped his tractor at the boundary fence. You miss a section, he called. Elena kept driving. Dean laughed and pointed toward the standing grass. You planning to harvest that next month? Several men, working behind him, looked over. One of them raised a hand in mock encouragement. Mara heard them from the rake. Her face tightened. Elena had warned her not to respond, but silence was harder when the laughter was aimed at her family. They think we don't know what we're doing, Mara said when Elena stopped beside her. They think a field should be harvested all at once. Isn't that normally better? It is faster. That's not what I asked. Elena looked across the ridge. The cut grass had already begun to lose its bright green color. The wind was stronger there than the day before, and the thin rows moved gently in the sun. If the whole field dried the same way, cutting it together would make sense. But it doesn't. No. Mara glanced toward Dean's land. His fields were almost completely down. Long windrows covered the ground from the road to the northern fence. His crew moved in sequence, one tractor turning another, raking a third, preparing to bale. Everything about his operation appeared organized. Everything about theirs looked hesitant. At noon, Russell Pike arrived in a white pickup. The hay buyer stepped out wearing clean boots that had never spent much time in mud. He did not greet Elena immediately. He looked first at the small area she had cut, then at the standing crop below it. This is all he asked. For today, I need 80 bales. I remember. Russell walked into the ridge field and lifted a handful from the windrow. This top layer is moving well. The top always moves first. He dropped it. Dean expects to start baling this afternoon. Dean has different ground. He also has hay ready when buyers need it. Elena did not answer. Russell removed his sunglasses. I have 3 stables asking for delivery. I cannot explain to them that you are waiting because one corner of your field holds dew. I'm not asking you to. Then give me a date. I'll give you one when the hay is safe. His expression changed. Russell had worked with Elena for years. He respected her product, but he had no patience for uncertainty. Buyers paid him for reliable supply, not careful reasoning. By tomorrow morning, he said, I need an answer. If you cannot fill the order, I'll buy the balance from Dean. Mara looked at her mother. Elena kept her eyes on Russell. Do what you need to do. He nodded, once returned to his truck and drove away. For several seconds, neither Elena nor Mara spoke. Then Mara threw her gloves onto the tractor seat. We're losing the buyer. We may lose part of the order. That's most of the order. Yes. And you just let him leave. I cannot promise hay that is not ready. You could cut more and put it where? On the field. Exactly. Mara stared at her. Elena pointed toward the lower slope. If we cut that ground now, the thickest stems will still be holding moisture tomorrow afternoon. If the storm arrives early, it will all be lying flat against wet soil. You don't know the storm will arrive early. No. Then this could all be for nothing. The words came out harder than Mara intended. Elena looked toward the barn. For the first time since morning, doubt entered her face. Not because Dean had mocked her, not because Russell had threatened to leave, because Mara had named the truth. Elena could read conditions. She could compare risk. She could recognize patterns. But she could still be wrong. A stronger wind could arrive that afternoon. The middle field could dry faster than expected. The storm could weaken, change direction, or arrive exactly when the forecast predicted. If that happened, Dean would finish first, Russell would buy his hay, and Elena would be left with an older crop and fewer customers. She walked to the test windrow on the ridge. The grass on top felt light. The stems at the center were still flexible, but they had lost much of their earlier coolness. The conditions were improving. For several minutes, Elena considered cutting the middle slope. She imagined the mower moving downhill, the entire farm finally looking like the others. The decision would quiet Mara. It might keep Russell. It would end the comments from the road. She climbed into the tractor. Mara picked up her gloves. "Are we cutting the rest?" Elena started the engine. The mower lowered. She drove to the edge of the standing grass and stopped. Ahead of her, the slope descended toward the old creek bed. From the tractor seat, the field looked dry. Sunlight covered it. The seed heads moved in the wind. Then Elena noticed the red cloth tied to the lower fence. It hung still. The breeze crossing the ridge was not reaching the bottom. She shut off the engine. Mara walked over. "What happened? Come down with me." They crossed the uncut slope on foot. Halfway down, the air changed. The heat remained, but the wind weakened. Near the creek bed, the ground felt cool beneath their boots. Elena parted the grass. Moisture remained on the lowest leaves. Mara touched the stems. The difference was immediate. The ridge had been warm and moving. The lower field was sheltered and damp. Elena looked uphill at the tractor. From there, the whole farm had appeared ready. From inside the field, it was not. "That's why you stopped," Mara said. Elena nodded. She had nearly made the decision from a distance. The same mistake she accused others of making. They returned to the ridge without cutting another row. By late afternoon, Dean's baler entered his southern field. The first finished bale rolled onto the ground. His crew cheered. Mara watched from the Ward barn as more bales appeared behind it. Each one seemed to prove that waiting had been a mistake. Elena checked her pressure gauge. It had fallen again. She checked the sky. A thin band of cloud had formed beyond the western ridge. Not a storm yet. Not proof. Only another piece of evidence. She wrote the reading in her notebook. Mara stood beside her. "Do you still think we're right?" Elena closed the cover. "I think the lower field is not ready. That isn't the same answer." "No," Elena said. "It's the only honest one." Across the valley, Dean's baler completed another row. On the Ward farm, most of the crop remained standing. The difference between caution and failure had never looked thinner. The next morning, Elena checked the ridge before sunrise. The cut hay had taken on dew again, but less than the day before. The stronger overnight breeze had kept moisture from settling as heavily across the upper ground. That was the good news. The bad news was the pressure gauge. It had fallen farther. Elena tapped the glass once, then wrote the reading in her notebook. Mara stood beside the barn door, watching the eastern sky brighten. "The forecast still says rain tomorrow evening," she said. Elena opened the weather app. The hourly display showed sun through most of the day. Clouds were expected to increase the next morning, with storms arriving after 6 in the evening. On the screen, they still appeared to have more than 30 hours. On the farm, they had much less. The ridge hay could not begin drying again until the dew lifted. It would need several warm hours before Elena could rake it. Then the center of each windrow would need time to release more moisture before baling. At sunset, cooling air would slow the process again. Tomorrow morning could bring another layer of dew. And once clouds arrived, even without rain, the field would lose heat. Elena drew a line across a page in her notebook. Above it she wrote, "Time without rain." Below it, "Usable drying time." They were not the same. "Today gives us perhaps 6 good hours," she said. Mara looked at the clear sky. "Only 6, if the dew lifts by 10 and the humidity rises again near 4. And tomorrow we do not know yet." Mara studied the field. "So the forecast gives us a day and a half, but the hay may get less than 1 full day of actual drying." Yes, that was the calculation Elena believed the others were missing. A farmer did not need rain to lose the harvest window. Heavy morning moisture, weak wind, rising humidity, and early cloud cover could take the useful hours away long before the first drop fell. At 8:30, Elena walked the ridge. The top of the windrow felt nearly dry. The underside remained cool but no longer wet. She pulled stems from the center and twisted them. They resisted before folding. Progress. She checked 3 more places. The eastern edge was driest. The section beside the tree line was behind. The center of the ridge was close enough to turn. Elena climbed onto the tractor and attached the tedder. Mara followed in the smaller machine. They spread the hay into a thinner layer, lifting the damp underside into the sun. The work had to be done carefully. Turning too early could pack wet grass into clumps. Turning too aggressively after the leaves dried could knock valuable material from the stems. Elena kept the machine slow. Each pass opened the crop to the air. By noon the wind strengthened. For the first time that week, the cloth tied to the ridge fence stayed extended. Mara smiled when she saw it. Now it's drying. Now it has a chance. They checked the hay again at 1 o'clock. The thinner stems were nearly ready. The thicker ones still bent. Elena used the moisture meter in several places, taking readings from the center of compressed handfuls rather than the exposed surface. The numbers were improving, but uneven. Mara pointed toward the baler. Could we start with the driest rows? Not yet. Dean started yesterday. Dean's decision does not change our readings. A truck approached from the road. Russell Pike stopped beside the barn. He did not get out immediately. He watched Elena test several windrows, then stepped from the cab. I came for your answer, he said. Elena stood. The ridge should be ready late today. How many bales? Perhaps 25. I asked for 80. The rest is still standing. Russell looked toward the middle and lower fields. You are giving up most of the order. I am protecting most of the crop. Dean can supply everything by tomorrow morning. Then buy what you need from him. Russell removed his cap and rubbed the mark it had left across his forehead. I would rather buy from you. Your hay is cleaner. Then take the ridge when it is ready. And the balance, after the storm. He looked toward the clear sky. You are that certain? No. The answer irritated him. Then what exactly are you doing? Elena pointed to the ridge hay. I know this section has had enough airflow to finish. I know the lower ground has not. I know my equipment cannot cut, turn, and bale the rest safely before the weather begins changing. That is a lot of caution for a storm that has not arrived. It is less caution than putting 80 acres on the ground because an icon on a screen is blue. Russell's jaw tightened. For a moment Mara expected him to leave. Instead he walked into the windrow and pulled a handful from the center. He bent the stems, then looked toward Dean's field across the valley. What time will these be ready? If the wind holds near 5. I will send a truck at 6. For 25 bales for whatever passes your test. He returned to the pickup. Before leaving, he looked back at Elena. If you are wrong, there may not be another order. I understand. By 2:30 the sky remained bright, but the air had changed. The wind had shifted slightly south. It was warmer, yet the hay was no longer losing moisture as quickly. Elena checked the humidity reading at the barn. It had stopped falling. She repeated the test an hour later. The number had begun to rise. Mara saw her expression. What does that mean? The air is holding more water, but the sun is still out. The sun cannot pull moisture efficiently into air that is already becoming damp. Elena returned to the field. Some rows were ready, others were not. She marked the driest section with blue flags and left the slower rows open. At 4 o'clock she connected the baler. The machine rattled as it entered the first windrow. Its pickup teeth lifted the hay, feeding it into the chamber. Several minutes later the first bale dropped onto the ridge. Mara climbed down and checked it. The bale was firm but not heavy. The internal reading remained within the range Elena had set. They continued. Not quickly, not across the whole field, only through the rows that had earned their way into the baler. By 5:30 clouds had appeared over the western ridge. They were thin and high, but they softened the sunlight. The wind weakened. Elena stopped after the 23rd bale. Mara looked at the remaining rows. There are at least 5 more. They are not ready. They are close. Close is not dry. We could finish before Russell arrives. Elena shook her head. That would make the truck schedule our decision. Mara looked frustrated, but she did not argue again. Russell's truck arrived at 6. He tested several bales himself before loading them. 23, he said. That is all I can give you today. He looked toward the standing field, then toward the clouds. I hope this was worth it. So do I. After the truck left, Elena and Mara moved the remaining ridge hay into the widest, thinnest rows they could make. If the weather held through the next morning, they might still save it. At sunset, Elena climbed the hill behind the barn. From there, she could see nearly the entire valley. Dean's fields were covered with finished bales. Several remained outside. His crew had also cut the lower western parcel that afternoon, trying to complete the harvest before the predicted storm. Elena's middle and lower fields still stood. They looked late. They looked vulnerable. They also remained rooted above the soil. Mara joined her. "Do you think they will finish tomorrow, Dean?" "Yes, if the weather stays as forecast." "And if it does not," Elena watched the western clouds thicken. "Then the question will not be how much he cut." She looked down at the long rows spread across his lowest field. "It will be how much he left exposed." That night, the updated forecast moved the storm forward by 4 hours. It was now expected to arrive early Thursday afternoon. Elena checked the pressure once more. The needle had fallen again. For the first time, the official forecast had begun moving toward what the land had already been showing her. But the change was small. There was still enough time for Dean to believe he could finish, and just enough time for Elena to doubt whether she had waited too long. By sunrise, the forecast had moved the storm forward again. Rain was now expected before noon. Dean's crew began working before first light. Headlights crossed his fields as tractors pulled balers through the remaining windrows. Every machine ran at once. Men loaded finished bales onto trailers while others rushed to clear the lower parcel. From the Ward farm, the operation looked less like harvesting and more like evacuation. Mara stood beside Elena at the barn door. "They might finish." "They might. Should we cut the middle field now?" Elena looked toward the standing grass. "No. But we still have several hours." "We have several hours before rain. We do not have several hours to dry hay." The distinction no longer needed explanation. Mara understood it now. Elena walked to the ridge and checked the hay they had left overnight. The thinner rows were dry enough to bale. The heavier section near the tree line was still damp underneath. They began with the safe rows. The baler moved slowly across the ridge, producing one bale at a time. Elena stopped often to test the hay and check the machine. Across the road, Dean did not stop. By 8 o'clock, his crew had nearly cleared the southern field. Only the lower western parcel remained. That field had been cut last. It was also the coolest and least exposed section of his farm. Mara watched a tractor rake the hay into thick rows. "They are making them bigger, so the baler can collect them faster. Will the centers dry not before they bale? Then why are they doing it? Because the storm has changed the decision." Pressure had replaced patience. The question was no longer whether the hay was ready. The question was whether they could remove it before the rain. At 8:30, Dean drove to the Ward fence. He did not smile this time. "You still have most of your crop standing." "Yes. I can send a mower over. We could drop the middle field in an hour. It would still be wet when the rain arrived. At least it would be cut." Elena looked directly at him. "Cut hay is not harvested hay." Dean's expression hardened. "You think leaving it standing makes you smarter than everyone else. No. You think we all misread the weather. I think your lower field did not have enough drying time." Dean glanced toward his workers. "The meter readings are close." "From where?" "The windrow." "The top or the center?" He did not answer. Elena lowered her voice. "If the center is still cool, do not put it in the barn." Dean's face changed slightly. He knew what she meant. Wet hay inside a dense bale could heat after storage. The danger would not always be visible from the outside. "I know how to bale hay," he said. Then he returned to his truck. At 9:15, the wind stopped. Not weakened. Stopped. The cloth tied to Elena's fence fell flat. The air became heavy and still. Even the cottonwood leaves no longer moved. Elena shut off the tractor. Mara looked west. A dark line had appeared above the ridge. It was no longer a thin band of cloud. It stretched across the horizon dense and low, with a pale gray curtain beneath it. "Is that rain?" "Yes." "How far closer than the forecast says?" They had 4 finished bales left in the field and several rows that were still too damp. Elena made the decision immediately. "Move the dry bales into the shed." "What about the remaining hay?" "Spread it." Mara stared at her. "We are not baling it, no. If we spread it, it gets wet." "It will get wet either way. A thin layer will dry faster after the storm than a tight row pressed against the ground." They worked quickly. Mara pulled the finished bales toward the barn, while Elena widened the remaining rows. She resisted the temptation to compress the last hay simply to claim it had been saved. Across the valley, Dean's baler entered the lowest part of his western field. The windrows there were dark and heavy. A worker tested one bale, then waved the machine forward. At 10 o'clock, thunder rolled beyond the ridge. The forecast still showed rain beginning after 11:30. The sky disagreed. Russell Pike's truck appeared on the road. He slowed near Dean's field where crews were stacking the final bales. Then he drove to Elena's barn. "You have more ready?" he asked. 16. That is all that is dry." Russell looked toward the storm. "Dean says he can fill the rest of the order today." Elena nodded. "You should check the centers before you load them." "You think they are wet? I think his last field had less drying time than mine." Russell studied her face. "You are willing to lose the sale over that. I would rather lose the sale than send wet hay to a horse barn." Thunder sounded again, louder this time. Russell looked toward Dean's stacked bales. Then he took a moisture probe from the back of his truck. "I'll check them." At 10:20, the first cold gust crossed Bellwether Valley. Dust lifted from the road. The cottonwoods turned silver. Elena closed the barn doors as Mara brought in the final bale. They stood beneath the roof and watched Dean's crew race the storm. The first drops struck the metal above them. Then the rain came all at once. Heavy, wind-driven water swept across the valley. Dean's last windrows disappeared beneath it. Several trailers remained in the field. On the Ward farm, most of the crop bent under the rain but stayed rooted above the soil. Mara watched the standing grass move in the storm. For 2 days it had looked like proof that Elena was falling behind. Now it was the only crop in the valley that had not been left lying on wet ground. The rain lasted 3 hours. By early afternoon, water moved through the ditches and collected in every low place across the valley. Dean's cut fields had turned dark. Windrows that had been light and loose that morning were now flattened against the soil. On the Ward farm, the standing grass leaned under the weight of the rain, but most of it remained above the ground. Mara watched from the barn. "It looks damaged." "It is," Elena said. Several patches had lodged especially near the old creek bed. Some stems had bent low enough to touch the mud. Elena did not pretend the crop had escaped unharmed. Rain could lower quality even before cutting. Heavy wind could break stems. Repeated moisture could encourage mold if the weather stayed wet. But the standing crop still had one advantage. Air could move through it once the wind returned. The hay lying in Dean's windrows had no such protection. When the rain weakened, Elena opened the barn doors. The air smelled of wet soil and crushed leaves. Across the road, Dean's crew stood beside the last trailer. No one was loading now. Several bales remained in the field, their outer surfaces soaked. Russell Pike's truck was parked near them. He had arrived before the storm with his moisture probe. Now he stood beside an open bale. The center was darker than the outside. Dean saw Elena approaching and walked toward the fence. "You came to see the damage?" "No." "Then why are you here?" "To ask whether you found heat." Dean looked back at the open bale. "Not yet. Moisture higher than I wanted." Russell joined them. "The first rows are acceptable," he said. "The later bales are not." "How many?" Elena asked. Russell glanced toward the trailers. "At least 40 need to be opened or kept out of storage until they are checked again." Dean's jaw tightened. "We can spread them after the rain." "You may have to," Russell said. The problem was not only the water falling on the outside. The later bales had been made from hay that was already holding moisture inside. Rain had added more. If those bales were stacked tightly in a barn, heat could build where no one could see it. Dean looked toward his lower field. Several windrows had begun to collect muddy runoff. His crew would have to spread the hay again, wait for dry weather, turn it, and test it before baling a second time. Each extra pass would cost fuel and labor. Each turn could knock more leaves from the stems. The crop was not worthless. But it was no longer the harvest Dean had expected. Russell looked at Elena. "How many dry bales did you put under cover?" 39. "I'll take them." Dean turned sharply. "You still need more than that." "I do. I can supply the rest." "Not from the last field." Dean stepped closer. "You tested 1 bale. I tested 6. Russell's voice remained calm. "The readings were highest in the center. I'm not sending those to a horse barn." Dean looked at Elena as if she had caused the result. She had not. The storm had not proved that she could predict weather perfectly. It had proved that the drying time had been shorter than the valley assumed. That difference had mattered most in the fields cut last. Mara came down from the barn and stopped beside her mother. Russell pointed toward the Ward field. "What happens to the standing crop now?" "We wait for the ground to drain. Then we cut the ridge sections first. And the lodge grass, we lift it slowly with the mower. Some will be lost." Russell nodded. "When will you know the quality?" "After it dries." He gave a tired smile. "You never promise before you know." "No. That used to frustrate me. And now I have 40 bales across the road that were promised too early." Dean turned away. For a moment, Elena considered saying nothing. Then she called after him. Do not stack the wet bales together. He stopped. I know. Keep air around them. Check the centers again tonight. Dean looked back. There was no mockery left in his face. Only exhaustion. You were right, he said. Elena shook her head. I was cautious. The storm came early. That part could have changed. But you saw something. I saw that the hay would not dry fast enough if it did. Dean looked toward her field. Most of the grass was still standing in the rain. For 2 days he had treated that as evidence of fear. Now he understood it had been a decision about exposure. Elena had risked lower quality by waiting. He had risked the whole crop by placing it on the ground. Neither choice had been free. One had simply left more options after the storm. That evening Elena and Mara walked through the middle field. The soil was soft, but water had already begun draining toward the old creek bed. Elena lifted several bent stems and checked the base. The plants were wet but clean. Mara looked across the valley. Everyone said you were wasting time. I was using time differently. Because you knew the storm was coming, Elena stopped. No. She pointed toward the standing grass. I knew this crop was safer here than cut on the ground before it had enough time to dry. Mara nodded. The lesson was finally clear. Reading the land did not mean knowing the future. It meant knowing which mistake the farm could survive. The rain moved east before nightfall. By the next morning the sky was clear again, but the fields were too wet to enter. Elena waited. Dean's crew returned immediately to spread damaged hay across the ground. Their tractors left deep tracks in the soft soil, and several bales had to be broken apart by hand. On the Ward farm, most of the crop remained standing. Some sections had been flattened by the wind, but the upper and middle fields had survived better than Elena expected. Mara looked across the wet grass. When can we start, when the ground can carry the tractor without tearing itself apart? They waited another day. The wind returned from the north, cool and steady. The ridge dried first. Elena cut it in the afternoon, then moved slowly into the middle field the following morning. She left the low ground near the creek untouched. This time Mara did not question the decision. They worked in sections. Cut, turn, test, bale. The process was slower than Dean's original harvest, but there was no panic now. The storm had passed, and the forecast showed several stable days ahead. Some of the lodged grass was difficult to lift. Elena had to lower the mower carefully, and a small part of the crop remained too close to the mud to save. She accepted the loss. The goal was no longer to recover every stem. It was to protect the quality of what remained. Russell Pike returned on the third afternoon. He checked several bales from the ridge, then tested samples from the middle field. These are good, he said. How many do you need? As many as you can give me. Elena looked toward Dean's farm. Did you not buy the rest from him some? The early bales were fine. The later ones need more drying. Russell closed the moisture meter. Your crop is slightly more mature than usual. I know. The stems are firmer. I know that too. But it is clean, dry, and safe. That was the trade Elena had chosen. She had lost some feed quality by delaying the harvest. But she had avoided placing most of the crop on the ground before the storm. The result was not perfect. It was survivable. By the end of the week, the Ward barn held enough hay to cover the bank payment and most of the repair bill. Elena would still need to postpone drainage work in the lower field, but she would not have to sell the upper pasture. Mara found her mother at the kitchen table that evening. The bank letter lay open beside the harvest records. Is it enough? Mara asked. Elena nodded. Barely. But we keep the pasture, yes. Mara sat across from her. For several moments, neither of them spoke. Then Mara pulled the old green notebook closer. On a blank page, she wrote the date of the storm. Below it, she added forecast rain Thursday evening, actual rain Thursday morning. Ridge cut and protected. Middle field left standing, harvested after storm. Low ground delayed again. Elena watched her. What are you doing? Recording what happened. Why? So next time we remember more than who was right. Elena smiled. That was the correct lesson. The storm had not proven that old knowledge was better than modern forecasting. It had proven that the two measured different things. The forecast described the larger weather system. The field revealed how that system would affect one specific farm. A week later, Dean stopped at the Ward fence. He did not mention the jokes. He looked toward the old creek bed where Elena still had not cut. That ground always dries last, he asked. Yes. How much later? Depends on the wind. Dean nodded toward the red cloth tied to the fence. And that tells you, it tells me whether the air is moving where the hay actually lies. He remained silent for a moment. Then he asked, "Next season, would you show me how you divide the fields?" Elena looked toward Mara. Her daughter was standing near the barn with the notebook under one arm. "Yes," Elena said, "but you will need to walk them." Dean glanced down at his clean boots. For the first time he laughed at himself. Then he climbed over the fence. By late summer the storm had become a story people repeated differently. Some said Elena had predicted it. Others claimed she had simply been lucky. Elena corrected both versions whenever she heard them. She had not known exactly when the storm would arrive. She had known only that most of her hay would not dry in time if the forecast changed. That difference mattered. Mara began joining her mother on the early walks through the fields. She carried the old green notebook, but she also brought a small weather meter and a moisture probe. Each morning she recorded the temperature, humidity, wind near the ground, and the time the dew disappeared from each section of the farm. She no longer treated the property as one field. The upper ridge caught the wind first. The middle slope held moisture beneath the thick grass. The old creek bed remained colder and dried last. A forecast could describe the valley, but these differences determined what Elena could safely harvest. One morning Mara tied a new strip of red cloth to the lower fence. Elena watched it rise slightly then fall. "Not enough wind yet," Mara said. Elena nodded. She did not need to explain. Dean Mercer began walking his own fields before starting his machines. He still used the forecast, but he also checked the centers of his windrows and compared the higher ground with the sheltered sections. The change did not make him slower. It made his speed more deliberate. Russell continued buying hay from both farms. He now tested every late bale himself, especially when a harvest window was short. No one mentioned the jokes made before the storm. They did not need to. The strongest reversal was not an apology. It was seeing the people who had mocked Elena begin using the same questions she had asked. Was the wind reaching the ground? Had the dew truly lifted? Were the thick stems dry inside? Could the equipment finish before the weather changed? The Ward farm did not become wealthy because of one harvest. The tractor still needed repairs. The lower fields still needed drainage work. Elena and Mara still counted every fuel bill and every bale. But the upper pasture remained theirs. At the end of the season, Mara added one final note beneath the storm record. The land did not tell us when the rain would come. It told us what would happen if we were not ready. Elena read the sentence twice. Then she closed the notebook and handed it back. "Keep writing," she said. Mara looked across the fields. The grass had begun growing again where the storm had bent it. New green shoots appeared between the older stems, following the same slopes, low places, and hidden paths of water that had shaped the farm for generations. The lesson was not to distrust technology. It was not to delay every harvest. It was to remember that information gathered far away could never replace attention given to the ground beneath one's own feet. The forecast had measured the approaching storm. Elena had measured the vulnerability of her crop. And when the rain finally came, the land proved that she had been listening to the question that mattered most. 2 weeks after the storm, the county agricultural office held its monthly meeting at the Bellwether Grange Hall. Farmers came to discuss drainage problems, damaged hay, and the short harvest window that had caught so many of them off guard. Dean Mercer sat near the front. Elena chose a chair near the back. When the county advisor began speaking, he displayed a map of the storm system and explained how quickly the pressure had fallen before the rain arrived. The forecast changed late, he said, but the larger problem was that several fields had less drying time than expected. He showed photographs of wet windrows, damaged bales, and machinery tracks pressed into soft ground. Then he asked a simple question. Did anyone adjust the harvest by field position rather than cutting the entire farm at once? Several heads turned toward Elena. She remained silent. Dean stood. Elena Ward did. The room grew quiet. Only days earlier he had mocked her for leaving most of her crop standing. Now he described what she had done without exaggeration. She cut the ridge first, he said. She left the sheltered ground alone because the wind was not reaching it. I thought she was falling behind. He paused. She was limiting how much hay she exposed. The advisor looked toward Elena. Would you explain your decision? Elena stood slowly. I did not know the storm would arrive early, she said. I knew the lower field was drying too slowly. She explained the main signs without turning them into mystery. The dew remained late on the middle slope. The wind moved through the treetops, but not through the lower grass. The test strip regained moisture overnight. The thick stems were drying much more slowly than the surface. Her equipment could not finish the whole farm before conditions changed. So you trusted the land instead of the forecast? Someone asked. Elena shook her head. I used both. She pointed toward the map at the front of the hall. The forecast told me what might reach the valley. The field told me how prepared my crop was to meet it. The advisor nodded. That distinction is important. He explained that regional weather data could not account for every sheltered slope, low area, soil type, or difference in equipment capacity. Two farms under the same forecast might have very different harvest windows. The lesson was not that technology had failed. The lesson was that local observation completed the information. After the meeting, several farmers gathered around Elena. They asked about her test strips, her field map, and the notes her father had kept. Dean waited until the others moved away. "I owe you an apology," he said. Elena looked at him. "For what?" "For deciding that waiting meant you were afraid." "I was afraid." Dean seemed surprised. "I thought fear was the reason you should have cut." "It was the reason I checked twice." He nodded. "My lower bales are still spread behind the barn. I may save some of them. I hope you do." Dean looked down at his boots. "I also lost the sale to Russell." "You lost part of it." "That is enough to remember." There was no humiliation in his voice now, only recognition. He had not been defeated because Elena possessed secret knowledge. He had been defeated by his own assumption that speed was always the safest response. The following week, Dean arrived at the Ward farm before sunrise. He carried a notebook. Mara met him at the fence and handed him a metal rod. "What is this for?" he asked, checking how soft the soil is between sections. He looked toward Elena. "She is serious. She usually is." The three of them walked from the ridge toward the old creek bed. They compared the temperature of the soil, the movement of air, and the moisture near the base of the grass. Dean asked fewer questions as they descended. By the time they reached the lowest ground, he could feel the difference without being told. The air was cooler. The soil gave way more easily. The grass remained wet long after the ridge had begun to dry. Dean looked back uphill. "From the road, it all looks the same." "That was my mistake too," Elena said. He glanced at her. "When the day before the storm, I nearly cut the middle field because it looked ready from the tractor. What stopped you? I walked into it." Dean wrote that down. The reversal was complete not when the storm proved Elena correct, but when the man who had mocked her began changing how he worked. He still owned more land. He still had better machinery. But he no longer believed that scale allowed him to ignore the details beneath his tires. At the edge of the ridge, the morning wind lifted the red cloth tied to the fence. Dean watched it carefully. This time no one laughed. Autumn came quietly to Bellwether Valley. The damaged fields recovered unevenly. Some farmers saved most of their hay. Others sold part of it at a lower price. Dean recovered more than he first expected, though the loss from the lower field stayed with him. On the Ward farm, the upper pasture remained untouched by developers. The bank payment had been made. The tractor still rattled on steep ground, and the drainage work near the old creek bed would have to wait until spring, but the farm had survived another season. One evening, Mara sat at the kitchen table with three things in front of her: her grandfather's notebook, Elena's harvest records, and the weather data from her phone. She compared the entries from the week of the storm. The official forecast had not been useless. It had shown the approaching system and warned the valley that the weather would change. But it had not shown how long dew remained on the middle slope. It had not shown that the lower field stayed still while wind crossed the ridge. It had not shown how slowly moisture left the thickest stems. And it had not known how many acres Elena's old equipment could safely finish in a day. Mara turned to a clean page and wrote, "A forecast describes the weather. A harvest decision measures exposure." Elena read the sentence from across the table. "That is better than anything I wrote at your age." Mara looked toward the window. "Do you think Grandpa would have delayed too? I think he would have walked the field." "That is not an answer. It is the only answer that matters." Elena sat beside her. "No rule works every year. Sometimes waiting costs quality. Sometimes cutting early saves the crop. The land does not give the same instruction every season. Then what are we supposed to trust? Evidence." Elena tapped the old notebook. "Memory, then the weather data, tools." Finally, she pointed toward the dark fields beyond the window. "And what is happening in front of us?" The next morning, Mara walked to the lower fence before sunrise. The ridge was already beginning to dry, but dew still covered the grass near the old creek bed. She pushed the metal rod into the soil, checked the air, and wrote the time in the notebook. She did not expect the land to speak in words. She had learned that reading it meant noticing differences: where water gathered, where wind failed to reach, where the soil warmed first, where a crop looked ready from a distance but remained vulnerable underneath. As the sun rose, the red cloth on the ridge lifted in the breeze. The cloth below remained still. Mara marked both observations. Across the road, Dean was walking his western field instead of watching it from his truck. He stopped at several windrows, checking the centers with his hands before using the moisture probe. The storm had not changed the valley in one dramatic moment. It had changed the questions people asked before they lowered their machines. Elena joined Mara near the fence. Anything worth recording, the ridge has wind. The bottom does not. Elena looked across the field. So what does that tell you? Not enough yet. Elena nodded. They stood together as sunlight moved slowly down the slope. The valley had once mistaken Elena's delay for weakness because waiting looked like doing nothing. But her decision had never been passive. She had measured the field, reduced the area at risk, and accepted a smaller loss to avoid a larger one. The storm did not prove that Elena could predict the future. It proved that she had understood the present more clearly than the people who mocked her. The forecast had told the valley when rain might arrive. The land had told Elena what would still be exposed when it did.